McGraw Show on KTRS.
Yes, somebody did it. Listen to all 3,000 hours that are available of Nixon's White House tapes, and he put it in a book, and it's about as good as People magazine gets these days. The book is called The Nixon Tapes, and the author is Luke Nectar. Luke, welcome to Big 550 KTRS here in St. Louis.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
First, let's start with the actual, just the war of attrition you had to go on to do this. How did you listen to 3,000 hours of this?
A war of attrition is right, and loss of hearing, too, I think, a little bit. How did we get started? 3,700 hours recorded between February of 71 to July of 73, so not the entire presidency, but a little less than 2.5 years. And, how do you put this in a book? It's so big. And so me and my co-author, Douglas Brinkley, we decided let's make a book about what Nixon himself spent the most amount of time on most of his days. So this book focuses on Vietnam, on the opening in relations with China, on the Russians, plenty of politics, plenty of gossip. We're saving Watergate and other subjects from 73 for a separate volume to come.
Of the 3,000 hours, 700 are still classified, half because of personal reasons and half because of national security?
That's right. That we don't have an exact breakdown. There's between 700 and 800 hours is all we know. There's no current plan that I know of for the government to release these, even 40 years later. And a number of them are going to be national security. But, the last time the tapes were released or reviewed a couple decades ago, probably some of those could come out. Those aren't classified anymore. Others are still restricted because of privacy of a living person who is part of a conversation or mentioned. So a host of different restrictions are involved. As a historian, I certainly would like to see all these come out one day. I think the people of the country need to know what happened during the White House. So they're there. They're at the archives. So why not let it all out?
Sure, absolutely. The book is called The Nixon Tapes. And Nixon, from reading some of the excerpts of your book and reading some of your book, Nixon's, I kept thinking about this, that Nixon is a mad genius because Nixon knew he was being recorded, but the other people he was talking to or about or with didn't know he was being recorded.
That's exactly right, and readers have to keep that in mind. The vast majority of the people in the book, including Nixon's inner circle, did not know. Bob Haldeman, his chief of staff, did know, and some of his aides knew. The Secret Service, who ran the taping system, knew. But other Chuck Colson, Henry Kissinger, John Ehrlichman, and a whole cast of names that we recognize, George Bush, George Shultz, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, they're all on here, and they did not know. So it's very interesting to see how they behaved in the Oval Office, how they behaved around Richard Nixon. You're a fly on the wall is the perspective that this book gives you.
What are some of the surprising things that you found out about him that would be kind of non-presidential about him? The gossip.
Well, I think... Yeah, well, he had a healthy interest in the Kennedys, for example, which is something that isn't new that we know, but you get just the details of that. He's a person who, as far as we know, was never really personally involved in scandal or had an affair, but certainly the sexual lives and affairs of others was completely fair game when it came to gossip in the Oval Office. Nixon was somebody who I think admired as much as he was disgusted by the Kennedys and the positive treatment he thought they got all the time by the press. So Nixon was very interested in gossip by political rivals, political enemies, and you get that through here, the substance as well as the sensation in this book.
There's quite a bit of anti-Semitic conversation going on in the Oval Office, whether it's about Kissinger or about the Middle East. What were your thoughts listening to that 40 years later as a historian?
Well, certainly. Language you hear on these tapes now, 40 years later, we would call it sexist, we would call it anti-Semitic, we would call it bigoted. all these things. As a historian, one other thing I try to do is, for his time, was this inappropriate? Was he out of bounds for his time? And certainly there are cases where he still was. You're right. He's concerned about Henry Kissinger's Jewishness, especially when it comes to Kissinger running foreign policy in the Middle East, and Nixon did not think that was a conflict of interest he should have in his White House. So you do get this, as we say, this is unedited, this is unscripted, this is what happened in the Oval Office. And so we let the reader see all that, and so you hear Richard Nixon in his own words.
It sounds like he's making up some of the Vietnam bombing strategy as he's just off the cuff, in a sense, right?
Of course. I mean, there's difference between strategy and tactics. Strategy-wise, of course, Nixon wanted to get us out of the war as soon as he could. He wanted to return our POWs. He wanted to get what he thought was the best terms of peace for our country and get out of there. But on a day-to-day basis, as the casualty reports came in each day, sometimes multiple times a day, his thinking changed. And so it's a roller coaster. One day he's up, one day he's down. One day it's let's stick it out and let's bomb them. The other day is maybe we should just pull out and get out of there. So I think the reader really gets an unvarnished look here at this is policy making in real time. And he sticks to his principles, but you see the ups and downs of a president during wartime. And I don't think Vietnam and Nixon is that much different from other presidents in even more contemporary conflicts.
The book is called The Nixon Tapes, 1971 and 1972. Luke Nectar, the co-author of the book. Luke, the part of the book where he's bombing Vietnam to just show China or Russia how strong we are, it's almost like Vietnam had nothing to do with it.
The Vietnam was a pawn or a token in sort of the great power rivalry between the U.S. and then China and the U.S. And this is something that history will ultimately render its judgment on with Richard Nixon. Is could we have gotten out earlier? Did we stay in too long in the war? Just as to keep Vietnam as a negotiating chip, because of course the Russians wanted us out of Vietnam, the Chinese certainly wanted us out of Vietnam. That was their neighbor, and so Nixon kept it going because he could use that as a bargaining tool with China and Russia. And is that right? Is that principled? Is it not? I think history will render its verdict on that.
What's the one thing, Luke, that you heard that you had to stop the tape, take off the headphones, and rub your eyes and say, wow, I can't believe I just heard that?
Well, there's so many moments like that in the book, whether it's politics, whether it's gossip, whether it's policymaking. Sticking with Vietnam for a minute, I've never heard before, there's a conversation we have in the book, Richard Nixon actually considered resigning or bowing out of the 1972 election. And you think, oh, is that serious? For example, would President Obama resign or not run for re-election this past year because of Iraq or Afghanistan or health care? Well, don't forget, people forget in 1972, just 4 years before, Lyndon Johnson did just that. He bowed out. He did not run for re-election because of the Vietnam War. And so Nixon was seriously willing to go away quietly because the war wasn't going very well in 1971. And so I thought, that's really a new thing that I didn't know as I was listening to these tapes.
Yeah, Luke Nectar, our guest, listen to 3,000 hours. Go get some sleep and go on vacation, Nick. The book is The Nixon Tapes, 1971, 1972. Professor, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
7:58 here, Big 550 KTRS. Tim Weiland is in the St. Louis Plaza Company Traffic Center, sponsored by Dining Green.
And McGraw, there's a new accident now. We're going to call it eastbound/westbound 44 downtown. It is just by the Edward Jones Dome.